From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz will provide this week's cattle market commentary. Lee will talk about the general upward momentum currently in the cattle trades, and he'll preview this Friday's USDA Cattle on Feed report. Following then, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney will talk about grazing stocker calves on fall-planted cover crops. She'll discuss what K-State field trials say about managing those grazing calves on those forages for the best growth performance. Later on then, Jeff Wickman with this week's forage segment. He'll talk with K-State's Pam Van Horn and Wyatt Minihan about the National 4-H Hall of Fame induction ceremony they attended earlier this month. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. It's good to have you aboard once more for Agriculture Today. Well, we turn now to a livestock economist out of Iowa State University for this week's observations on the cattle market trends, talking once more with Lee Schulz. Lee, we'll recap last week's trade first of all here and then get into an assortment of things. But how would you describe the trend last week? There was a mixed feeling, if you will, in the fed live cattle trade.
Certainly mixed, and I think you have to really separate early week from later in the week. We continued the rise in the cattle market, especially when we look at the fed cattle market. Really all futures contracts were up, and then really Thursday and Friday came about. We've seen some strong declines there. I think the catalyst there was the news out of the Cargill Dodge City plant that we're going to lose a slaughter day or two out of that plant, and I think the market really took that news pretty poorly and traded a little bit lower. Although cash trade, I think, was pretty strong, especially early in the week. That helped hold futures for most of the week. And really, when you look at cash trade, we're trading higher than year-ago levels currently with larger supply. So I think, the markets have really moved past a lot of the issues that we've seen in August and September and are much more trading kind of the fundamentals of the current market. The feeder cattle market, I think, was a bit mixed, but overall we've seen some strength over the last couple of weeks here.
Want to expand on that in a second, but you mentioned it, the temporary shutdown of that Cargill plant in Dodge City because of the explosion. There are expectations that plant would be online early this week. You couple that with the Tyson plant still idled because of the fire earlier. Does that actually cause any short-term currentness issues in the market? For the trade seem to be playing off of that theme.
Really, I think it comes down to how long this plant remains idle. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty. We knew the impact was Thursday, Friday, Saturday of last week. That showed up when we looked at slaughter levels. We were running pretty much at par to the previous week, and then on Thursday we were 6,000 head lower, Friday 7,000 head lower, and then Saturday we got a big jump up to really get more of those cattle slaughtered, up 9,000. So I think so far the market's kind of handled the current supply of cattle, but there has been some news that, maybe it's likely to open here on Monday, but could the plant take a little bit longer to get back up online? Do they use this as an opportunity to clean some coolers? Is it maybe a week off? And then we may start to talk a little bit about the currentness issue. Overall, I think the market has been pretty current, but we have seen fed cattle weights start to creep up, which may start to be an indication on the currentness of the market. Last cattle on feed report showed that cattle on feed over 90 days was up 151,000 compared to a year ago. That was the September data. Over 120 days was up 210,000 compared to a year ago. So I think we're going to really watch that in the cattle on feed report this week to give an indication of how current this market is.
Well, you mentioned it there. Let's go ahead and follow up. The cattle on feed report will be out this Friday. What are the general expectations going in there?
Expectations, I think, are we placed more cattle in September than a year ago levels. Some of that's related to we had one more business day in the month, but we have really seen, I think, the start of a ramp up of cattle placement, so that's starting to put us above year ago levels. Actually, marketing rates were pretty strong, above year-ago levels. I think that's related to that additional business day. But overall, I think we're going to come in on feed number October 1, maybe slightly below year-ago levels. I think some of that relates to the placement numbers, but also some of the strength in the marketing numbers. Again,
that'll be released this Friday by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Lee, the feeder cattle market, as you note, is doing well. The demand for calves for wheat pasture in the southern plains. What are you hearing about in that regard?
I think we're starting to really, see a ramp up in demand there as conditions have been good from a forage standpoint. Also, when you look at the opportunity to add weight to calves, market at a little later date, I think the futures market is suggesting the opportunity to do that with that value of gain opportunity. And if we're seeing at least moderation in feed costs, that would suggest there's a value proposition there. Also, I think when you look at just the overall demand for calves, it's likely coming yet. So the fact that it's pretty strong now, farmer feeders, at least here in the north, really haven't been interested in calves yet as we're still full-fledged into harvest. So I think you're going to see a ramp up in demand for calves here in the next couple of weeks. So I think that's really all supportive possibly of calf prices.
And there is talk of an improved outlook for at least decent positive returns to finishing cattle heading into 2020. Your colleague here at K-State, Glenn Tonzer, elaborated on that in his Kansas numbers last week with us. That's got to be an incentive as well for this feeder cattle trade, does it not?
It certainly is, and really a turn from the last 6 weeks or so when we looked where cattle prices were. Really the opportunity, I run similar estimates here at Iowa State, and really you can hedge or lock in a profit for the first 6 months of 2020, and that really aligns with placements from this last August through the first of 2020, so through January 2020. So that certainly is going to be supportive of yearling prices as we kind of finish out quarter four here and into 2020. All of that, I think, is pointing to higher prices possibly as we get into the year, and more of a reason for people to potentially background calves as we get some support in those prices.
Well, aligned with that, those producers who might be backgrounding some calves or for our cattle finishers as well, we wonder where the corn market may be headed with some doubts about the actual output of this crop because of the problems with harvest progress and so forth. With that uncertainty about corn prices, should cattle feeders be looking at pricing feedstuffs in advance in anticipation of corn prices going up?
I don't think so yet. I think it's something certainly to keep an eye on. But given all the possible supply-related issues, really dating back to the planning issues, and now as we get into harvest, potentially there, just the delay in harvest and how big this output could be, there's certainly issues with usage right now, so demand for that crop, and I think that's really limited potential large gains in corn prices, and really should keep a cap on those prices. Now, something to really keep an eye on as we progress through this harvest, but overall, feed costs have remained relatively low, especially compared to what they could have been when we looked at this spring. So, if you hadn't done anything this spring, I think that's an indication that just hold back and kind of look at prices as we progress through this harvest.
And one further item here. Cow-calf producers who are running their spring calving herds through preg check at this time, well, they may be coming up with an open cow or two and wondering if the market is favorable to them at the moment to cull those cows. What's the latest on cull cow prices?
They've actually shown some life since the later part of summer, and we actually may finish 2019 with higher cull cow prices than last year. However, the timing right now is not great for cull cow prices. As we look for the transition from October to November, when we look at cow prices historically, they've lost about $3.50 per hundredweight 8 of the last 9 years. So again, I think right now that you're really marketing into a large supply of cull cows on the market, and maybe looking at an opportunity to really put some white fat on those cows and market at a little bit later date when we might see a stronger cull cow market maybe into the turn of the year. Really, I've been pretty surprised actually. While we have seen higher cow slaughter, we have higher cow numbers, but overall I think we're seeing a lot of producers holding on to cows and looking at potentially higher calf prices in 2020 with the really good forage conditions we had this last year. That didn't impact costs all that much, and I think we're looking at another year of pretty strong cow numbers overall.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we let you go, how you see the fed and feeder cattle markets trending in the trading week ahead?
I think this is a real kind of critical here to see how it shakes out to start the week. We had been on a really good trajectory of strength in both box beef and cattle prices, fed cattle, feeder cattle prices, really seeing kind of a wrench thrown into that late week. But the fundamentals are really there. So I think this week, as we start out the week, it'll be real important to kind of set a tone for where the market's at. I think if slaughter numbers really continue to pick up and the market's able to handle those cattle as they have been for the last several weeks, I think we could kind of continue where that path at least or supportive of prices we've been on the last couple weeks.
We're looking forward to that, hopefully. And Lee, we appreciate the word as always. We'll catch up with you again in a few weeks. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.
Out of Iowa State University, livestock economist Lee Schulz there. And this is Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Coming your way next on Agriculture Today, thoughts for you cattle producers upon planning to utilize fall-planted cover crops as grazing forage heading into the deeper fall and then the winter. And our guest now has logged considerable research experience in the cover crop utilization for these purposes. Jaymelynn Farney is on the line with us once more. As you know, Jaymelynn is a beef systems specialist for K-State Research and Extension. She is based out of southeast Kansas. Jaymelynn, you have been inundated with questions about cover crops as grazing resources for several years now. This approach still has considerable momentum behind it, doesn't it?
It really does. Not just from our conservation practices using the cover crops, but many people have started figuring out that there's a cost associated with working on those conservation practices that might not have a direct monetary return. So luckily, cattle are the one that can fit into that system to be able to provide a little bit of extra revenue or a method to recoup the cost of your cover crop.
So as you have interacted with producers, and of course you've conducted your own research, what types of cover crops really seem to be gaining the most attention right now?
Well, for our fall-winter ones, of course, our wheat is always a very, very popular one. And more people are choosing to graze wheat just because of the economic stimulus. Wheat returns are pretty tight.
Yep.
And, even though we're not making a whole lot of money in the cattle market right now, that still can provide you a chance to be able to capture a little more revenue. So, of course, wheat is one of our biggest cover crops for grazing, our annual forage for grazing. Any of the other small grains, oats, barley, rye in some parts of the state, triticale, as well as the brassicas such as turnip. Turnip is very popular. Radishes, and some of the work I've found shows that the forage radish in particular is kind of the more palatable type of brassica that we can have for our cattle. I've been hearing tremendously good comments about forage canola. I haven't been able to do any research projects with it yet, but that's been gaining in popularity as a cover.
And, of course, the planting has taken place for those who are interested in using these cover crops this fall and winter. So our purpose here is to talk about how to make the most of those grazing resources with your cattle herd. And we'll break it down into two segments, one of which we'll cover today, the other on tomorrow's broadcast. Let's get into, if we might, Jaymelynn, putting growing calves out on one of these cover crop stands. The management that a producer needs to consider there. Again, this is a good alternative for putting pounds on those growing steers or heifers.
It is. And, and once again, it is very operational specific. If your goal is to maximize gains, even though it said these cover crops are very high energy, very high protein, the amount of protein they have is slightly more than their energy to provide optimal intake and optimal gains. So to maybe clarify that a bit more, we like to have 3 to 4 times more energy in the feed stuff than we do protein. So if you get a sample of your cattle diet or ration, you want your TDN value to be 3 or 4 times higher than your crude protein value. So many of these cover crop or annual forage for the fall, they'll have maybe a TDN value of 60 and a crude protein value of 20. So they have about 3 times more energy than protein, which is a very good balance. Sometimes they don't have that much TDN. So if you want to maximize cattle gains, a little bit more energy on these fall forages, and these fall annuals, is your method to go about doing that. Some Oklahoma State data, they have the biggest data set on this, looking at grazing some wheat. If you provide a corn and soybean blend supplement at 0.5% of the calf's body weight, you can actually increase your stocking rate by 33% on that same wheat pasture and still maintain above a 2-pound average daily gain. So, that can be one way to, I said, if you're wanting to increase gains or increase your stocking rates, get more pounds of product, provide a little bit of supplement, mainly an energy type of supplement on these annuals.
And that would likely apply as a principle to other types of cover crops, Jaymelynn, beyond grazing wheat?
Most all of these fall small grains and brassicas end up being very similar in energy and protein values at same stages of growth. They do have different growth patterns. So like your oats and barley are a little earlier maturing. So if you go to test them right now, your oats and barley are going to have the most biomass today and probably have a little more energy and protein than, say, your wheat and rye. If you were to test in 3 months or 2 to 3 months, your triticale is going to have your most biomass and your highest quality. And then you go into the spring and your wheat and rye, that's when they're going to have their most biomass. and probably a high quality, while your oats and barley are mature and they're the lowest quality in the spring. So it's kind of a moving target, but at the same stage of growth, most of these small grains are similar in forage quality.
But you raise an important point. A producer, upon making the most of their cover crop management for grazing, they need to track the status of that cover crop, that forage, with some regularity through the fall and winter months then, do they not?
They really do. And, depending on what you have out there, you will have different grazing management strategies. Like I kind of alluded to, if you're looking for an early fall grazing and you want to have your heaviest stocking rate in early fall or in fall, early winter, you'll pick your small grains like oats and barley. Mm-hmm. If you're looking for something to graze more January, February through maybe even into April and May, you go with a rye or a wheat. And because triticale is a cross between one of those earlier maturing and later maturing plants, it kind of falls right in the middle.
Right.
Your brassicas, most of them will winter kill, so their highest biomass production occurs prior to a good killing freeze. After a good killing freeze, what's out there is what's going to be there. They're not going to continue to accumulate growth.
All right. Well, one further thing here, in as far as putting stockers out on cover crops for grazing, and this angle, you tell us, will be much more important when it comes to putting the cow herd out there. We'll cover that in tomorrow's segment. But how about mineral supplementation for those stockers to complement what they're getting from these typically nutrient-rich cover crops, and thinking about such things as a magnesium shortage, which could lead to grass tetany, for example? Should this be anything of a management priority for those running calves on these crops?
In regards to the grass tetany symptoms, that's not going to occur near as much with the growing animal. It is really exacerbated by lactation. So the high mag minerals, not as important for the stocker calf. Now, however, if you do have quite a bit of those brassicas, once again, because weaned calves, and especially if you have some high-risk calves, have an immunocompromised immune system, you want to make sure you can keep boosting that immune system. So I would go ahead and, for your stockers, maybe not add extra magnesium, but would go with the most bioavailable iodine, and maybe increase or use some more highly bioavailable zinc, copper, and manganese, just to kind of help with health.
Again, though, to cap this off, these cover crops, whichever ones you have growing out there on your acreage, can serve as a more than sufficient resource for growing those calves for the next several weeks, if one practices these good management steps that you've outlined for us here today, Jaymelynn. Now, there is this other side of the story, and that is how one can utilize cover crops for cow herd grazing, and what measures one needs to take to make sure that prospect goes well for them. We'll have you back on tomorrow, Jaymelynn, to get into that. Meantime, we appreciate the input right here. Many thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Our guest on this part of Agriculture Today, from her office in Parsons, southeast Kansas, Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney, K-State Research and Extension. We'll hear more from Jaymelynn on tomorrow's edition. Meantime, you're tuned to the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson back with you and with today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, it could take a few weeks for negotiators to hammer out the specifics of the Phase 1 U.S.-China trade deal. Here's an update on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
What exactly is in that Phase 1 trade deal with China?
I have not seen any specifics.
Undersecretary of Agriculture for Trade Ted McKinney in Hanoi, Vietnam, Friday, speaking to reporters by phone. Reporters who wanted to know more about the agreement. Was that $40 to $50 million of extra Chinese purchases referring only to food and ag products? Was this amount to be phased in or come all in 1 year? Again, McKinney said he's not seen any details, but...
In fairness, you'll recall that the president basically said,
we've come to a deal pretty much subject to getting it written. It'll take probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or 5 weeks.
To really put down on paper a lot of things that were conceptual.
But McKinney said details or not, it's still a positive thing for agriculture.
Because I think the two sides are back to talking. And also, you can never go wrong if they're talking about significant added purchase of food and ag products.
And Chinese purchases have already been increasing over the last 3 weeks. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
On a related note, USDA Deputy Secretary Steve Sinskey says $5.5 billion in market facilitation program payments, the second round, have been made to producers since the Farm Service Agency began issuing those checks back in August. The USDA is now deciding whether to go through with the next installment of trade relief payments to producers for 2019 production. Sinskey said the department is aiming to make a final call on that in the very near future. Quoting him, I think we are very much aware that producers have been impacted by the trade retaliation. They have been impacted by the weather and by low incomes as well, in Sinskey's words. MFP2 payments will potentially be in 3 installments. The first round became available over the summer. The second and third tranches will be available in November and January if warranted. Meantime, Senate Agriculture Committee Ranking Member Debbie Stabenow told Sinskey the trade mitigation program is upsetting the delicate balance that lawmakers attempted to strike in the 2018 Farm Bill relative to spreading federal dollars evenly across the agricultural sector. And Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has sent a letter to House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Richard Neal outlining the steps that Mexico is taking to strengthen labor standards relative to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Quoting Neal, I'm very pleased with Mexico's demonstration of good faith. He's among the Democrats working with the administration on USMCA issues. Neal met with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and said that Democrats are still looking for assurances on deal enforcement. Asked whether the two sides might be able to reach a handshake deal by Thanksgiving, Neal replied, quoting here, I would like to think that, but I think that's even based on what we discussed here today and that there's still a ways to go. And the chief executive officer for the United Soybean Board, Polly Ruland, spoke to the World Food Prize Symposium in Des Moines last week, raising the idea of U.S. protein groups working together on marketing plans and strategies, factoring in all meat and plant protein options, rather than pitting groups against each other. The focus there, called Protein First, as she dubbed it. When countries grow economically, they often move along a protein chain, Ruland pointed out. As incomes rise, people will move from plants to fish to eggs to poultry, pork, and beef. Quoting her, we know the potential for meat protein worldwide is growing exponentially, so I think there's a strategy here where everyone from plant protein to animal protein can get together and identify countries and where they are at in the customer journey of disposable income, in her words. Ruland said the World Food Prize was a very logical place to start talking about an international market and conversation about feeding the world. Quoting her again, we talk a lot about making more food to feed 9 to 10 billion people. We don't talk so much about the quality of food we're going to make and how that works in a global market. Now, Ruland noted that soybeans are used to feed both people and livestock, yet pork and beef benefit because of higher demand as disposable incomes rise. So she says there's a place for everyone in a collaborative protein strategy. She also related her strategy to some of the messages and conversation coming out of several CEOs at the symposium, discussing ways to make agriculture more driven by demand. The leaders for Corteva Agriscience, Bayer AG, Syngenta, and Chemin Industries shared a panel discussion about feeding the world in the year 2050. Collectively, the CEOs agreed that the world right now is falling short when it comes to the prospects of feeding 9 to 10 billion people. Do want to remind you of a calendar item coming up briefly here. The annual K-State Swine Day is now scheduled for Thursday, November the 21st. It'll be at the Alumni Center on the Kansas State University campus, starting at 8 in the morning and concluding at 4 in the afternoon. Plenty of research updates by K-State swine faculty, highlighting nutrition, management, feed processing, feed safety, and more, plus special speakers on specific topics. You can find out more about the program and the registration process at ksuswine.org. Now, this week's Tree Tales with K-State Forester Charlie Barton. Charlie?
Well, autumn is here, and with it has come cooler temperatures, and the plentiful or excessive rains have continued. While Kansas is not famous for its outstanding fall foliage displays, this looks like a good year for the trees to color up, although they will be a bit later this year due to that weather. While sugar and red maples are not that common in Kansas, there are several towns that have planted enough of these trees to really put on a show. Hiawatha in northeast Kansas and Baldwin City in the east central part of the state both sponsor festivals in October, so I think this year they will miss the peak color of these beautiful trees. Also, Highway 69 in eastern Kansas is a designated scenic byway, and the stretch from Lewisburg down to Fort Scott goes through numerous hills and valleys where groves of native sugar maple occur naturally, usually on the north-facing slopes. The village and stream named Sugar Creek in this area was named for the maple sugar industry that was active there in the late 1800s. Several of our more common native species also color up nicely, so look for the bright yellow of our cottonwoods and hackberry and the bright red of the sumac. Both of these species look more striking if they have a backdrop of dark green cedars or pines. The prairie grass have also changed color, and from a distance the hills appear a uniform rusty orange, but on closer inspection brilliant purples and other colors are evident, while some sunflowers, goldenrod, and asters are still in bloom. The pin oak, native to the southeast Kansas lowlands, turn a dark crimson in late October and into November, and the hickories abundant on the hillsides in this region turn a bright yellow. So this year, on your drive to a fall festival or football game, take a few minutes to enjoy our beautiful, unique fall landscape here in Kansas. You've been listening to Tree Tales. I'm Charles Barden, a forester with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Charlie. And this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The National 4-H Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held October 11th at the National 4-H Youth Conference Center in Chevy Chase, Maryland. K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn and Kansas 4-H student employee Wyatt Minihan, a K-State senior in agricultural communications and journalism, attended the ceremony. In fact, Wyatt served as the master of ceremony. Pam says the National 4-H Hall of Fame was founded in 2002 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of 4-H nationwide.
And at that time, there were 100 people that were inducted. And this year we inducted 16. It's sponsored by the three partners, the National Association of Extension 4-H Agents, 4-H Headquarters, which is part of USDA, NIFA, and the National 4-H Council. So it's a way that we honor those that have contributed to 4-H. And those individuals could be volunteers, staff employees, donors. It's anyone that has contributed broadly to 4-H and made an impact on 4-H locally and nationally.
And this is all done through applications and nominations?
The application process starts in February, and the 3 partners, they can submit 3 nominees, and each state has an opportunity to submit an application for a person.
And as you said, there were only 16 inducted, so a possibility there was someone from Kansas, also a possibility there wasn't this year.
This year there was not anyone from Kansas, but Kansas likes to boast that at this point we still have the most inducted into the National 4-H Hall of Fame from a single state.
And as you mentioned, these are primarily alumni and volunteers.
Alumni, volunteers, some of them that were inducted may never have been in 4-H, and then caught the bug when they were adults, when their children may have been 4-H members, or it may be a donor who just fell in love with 4-H after they learned what 4-H was all about.
Last year we had the entertainer who performed at the national ceremony. This year we had the master of ceremony. Wyatt, a little bit of background on yourself and then what your role was for this induction ceremony.
I grew up in Potawatomi County and was an 11-year 4-H member. I was very active in livestock, photography, and clothing. Came to Kansas State 4 years ago now. I'm a senior and majoring in agriculture, communications, and journalism. My passion in 4-H actually helped me choose my career major currently. I'm also an employee of the State 4-H office. I'm a student assistant there. That's how I actually figured out about the National 4-H Hall of Fame. And I went and I tried applying for it last year and obviously didn't get it last year, but this year I applied again and was lucky enough to get it, and it was a great experience. I got to meet new people that were very active in 4-H from all across the nation. It was a great opportunity for networking. Also got a very rich history in the 4-H and the National 4-H Hall of Fame. It was just overall a very good experience and helped me network and get a deeper, rich history of 4-H.
Probably a lot more to being the master of ceremony than just talking. Tell me a little bit about the background work that you had to do and all of the things you had to learn.
Obviously, there's a lot of practice. We practiced beforehand, before I left, practiced when we got there, practiced minutes before. Name pronunciation's obviously a big part of it. There's just like a lot of back work that went into it besides just standing up there and looking pretty.
I thought that was Pam's job, to stand up there and look pretty. But you mentioned that you had to learn all of the names. You probably had to learn town names and all of that. The evening, how did it go? Were you real happy with the way things went?
Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with the results of the ceremony. There was obviously a few words that I messed up just because of nerves and starting out. It was a little rough. But there towards the end, it kind of felt like second nature up there. It was very comfortable. It was very inspiring to hear all of their stories and their history of what they contributed to 4-H. And so that up there allowed me to understand like why I was there and how I was benefiting the night and everything like that. And so it was a very beneficial experience for myself.
How did 4-H prepare you for something like this? I know that that's one of the things that they really emphasize is being able to get up there and speak.
Obviously, years of public speaking. It seems like every time you go to a 4-H event, you have to talk to someone in front of someone. 4-H has allowed me to be comfortable in front of people and also the ability to just network with people and hold a conversation and everything like that with people that I may not know that well, but through 4-H has taught me to be able to hold a conversation and keep the conversation going with people, even if you may not know them or you don't have the same interests as them.
This all took place on one evening then? This was just a one-night program?
I showed up there Thursday evening and just kind of sat in my room. It was kind of an exhausting flight. But then Friday morning, it allowed me the opportunity to meet the Hall of Fame committee and individuals that helped put on the ceremony and everything. And then I also got to meet a few of the inductees beforehand. And then the ceremony happened, and afterwards there was like a little ceremony and rewards reception afterwards that allowed me to network with not only the inductees but also their families and friends that also traveled there to visit with us. And then the next day there was a breakfast that also allowed me the opportunity to say my farewells to everyone that was there attending.
Sounds like a good time.
It's a good time. It's very uplifting and motivating because each of the laureates have the opportunity to share a story, something inspirational about their careers or about 4-H. And they have 3 minutes to do this all in so that we wouldn't be there all evening because many of us could share stories upon stories, but we limit them to 3 minutes so that we can get in and out and then still have time to celebrate with them.
And is there a website where people can go and find out more about the Hall of Fame?
The National 4-H Hall of Fame is all electronic. There is not a wall, there's not plaques, but they could go to the NAE 4-HA website, or they could Google National 4-H Hall of Fame and it'll come up, and all the inductees from 2002 can be found on this website. There's a little bio. Some of them have up to 3 pictures. So it's just well worth the time to explore some of that, because there's some really founding pioneers that were inducted in that first class.
Always nice to learn the history.
It is, because it is amazing how things come around. Even though we think that we're very progressive, which we are in different ways, but that roots and that core values are still there of teaching.
That's K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn. Pam and Wyatt Minihan, a Kansas State University senior in agricultural communications and journalism and student employee with Kansas 4-H, both attended the National 4-H Hall of Fame ceremony near Washington, D.C., where Wyatt served as Master of Ceremony. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.